Do you like butter? If you enjoy eating butter on your toast all year, thank Martin Luther.
I'm going to cut it there. I don't remember where I cut it last time, but I'm going to cut it. One of these days, I'm just going to actually cut the audio, and we'll be fine.
Cool. So, little frame of reference. Oh, before we get too far into this, I'm Pastor Ben Oschlager. Welcome to Man Buns and Jesus. With me, as always, is Pastor Josh Laborious.
This is my voice and what it sounds like for those of you who are listening. Well,
I don't think we could have been
how
more
most people
awkward
engage
about
with the podcast is listening. So it's like you have to identify whose voice is whose.
Yeah.
This is Josh's voice, and that's Ben's voice.
I figured people would figure out the distinction between us when you just started talking and you didn't sound like me.
He's an impressionist. This is fast. I wonder.
Anyway,
continue.
The reason we opened today's episode with a conversation about butter.
Let's not say we. I'm not willing to accept responsibility for that.
The reason that I opened today's conversation episode with a conversation about butter is that we are talking about Article 26 of the Augsburg Confession, which is titled concerning the distinction among foods. And a large part of what this particular article has to do with
hold on, let me guess. It's about telling the difference between authentic beef and Impossible Burgers.
Not quite. It's actually...
And it is a distinction among foods, though.
Yeah, it's actually
That's what comes to mind when I read the title.
It's actually discerning between lamb and mutton.
Are those not the same thing?
It's how old the sheep is.
Okay, so they're the same thing.
Yep. But aged differently. Or discerning the difference between chicharrones and cracklins.
Again, are those not the same thing?
I think there's very, very minute differences in the ways that they're made.
Aren't they just both fried pork rinds? Am I misunderstanding something here?
I think one of them leaves a little bit more meat on it.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. Anyway.
These are the point that we're trying to make. I'm doing my best to derail the conversation as many times as I can.
So, which is, par for the course for our episodes. But the history here is in the Middle Ages, prior to the Reformation, there were a lot of traditions that the Catholic Church mandated that its parishioners would take part in. There were problems with those mandates, in part because of some of the ways that they went about enforcing them, and in part because of, the Roman Catholic Church was run out of Rome, and a lot of the people that ran it weren't thinking of anyone outside of Rome or Italy when they made these decisions, so it made it a lot more challenging for some people than for others. The butter distinction that I brought up earlier is one example of that. So, under Catholic tradition, during the season of Lent, leading up to the crucifixion of Christ, you might still see Catholic churches as you're driving down the road that advertise their fish fry on Fridays, right? Because they're not supposed to eat meat on Fridays in Lent. It used to be even more stringent than that you weren't supposed to eat meat at all in Lent, or anything that was animal product related unless you had hunted or fished it yourself. So fish and wild game were the exceptions. But in Italy, you could get things like olive oil for cooking fat. You could readily access fish because it's a giant peninsula that sticks out into a giant body of water. So there's pretty abundant sea life. In Germany, not so much.
It's good.
There's not nearly as much coastline. That coastline is in a very cold body of water that's also really deep and is not nearly as fish intensive. There was wild game.
I've never heard of German olives.
Yes, German olives are not really a thing. There's not a lot of wild game in Germany because it had mostly been hunted to near extinction. And so by banning butter and other animal products during Lent, the Catholic Church more or less mandated a month and a half of starvation in some parts of Germany. And Luther thought that was ridiculous.
I can't imagine why he would think something like that is ridiculous.
Yeah, as a German and as a man who loves butter, I'm very grateful that Luther came along.
I wonder what the stance on margarine would have been. Is
I
this
think
why
it
we
would have
have
been.
I can't believe it's not butter?
I think it probably would have been fine. Honestly, if they had gotten to the point where they could produce either margarine or I can't believe it's not butter or vegetable shortening even, they they probably would have been fine. But
Yeah,
that
that's
like
the problem. They were ahead of the industrial food curve. That was the
yeah.
issue here.
Yep, that was I mean, we could really pin this all on the fall of the Roman Empire, which stagnated ideological growth in
Those
Western Europe
darn
for
Roman empires keep stagnating things. It's just the trouble.
there's so many dumb ways that we can blame other people for this problem. But I mean, in the end, it really ended up being the Catholic Church causing a lot of problems for, especially the poor, in Germany and parts of France. Um,
Well, and you got to keep in mind too, like Luther was an academic,
yeah,
so there were practical problems with these decrees, but he also, and this is what he writes about in this article, he has a more philosophical, fundamental issue, and that is essentially you're making up extra rules for salvation.
yeah,
Romans tells us if you believe in your heart that, or if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So that's what Romans tells us. That's the theme of the New Testament.
yep,
Believe and confess. Period. And it's like the Catholic Church is like, well, hold on, you got to do this, this, and this too. And Luther's like, we have no basis that we can actually make these claims. That you also have to do X, Y, and Z. And in this specific instance, right, he's saying you can't add these traditions about food and say that they're required for salvation. That's a problem. And it can be expand, and he does expand here. It's added to certain traditions where these traditions are said, well, you have to do this, or you have to do this way, or a certain way, and that's the problem that Luther's taking. Because his fundamental issue is we can't add requirements to salvation. That is, first of all, that's not our place, and second of all, that is not right to do. Right, this is one of the reasons that Jesus came, is because he was removing the requirements of the covenant from us. He's saying you don't have to follow all of these Levitical laws anymore to earn salvation because I have earned it for you. So that's kind of the fundamental historical problem here. And it's not just a historical problem, right? People still do this today. And it's not just the Catholics. Hop on my high horse, but frankly, the only ones who really consistently have this licked, I would say, are the Lutherans. Because everybody, and people don't phrase it the same way, but everybody else has, and we do too, right? We have some things that we're like, we get really close to saying, this is something you need. Ours just tends to be proper theological understanding. That's what we want. But a lot of denominations say, well, to really be Christian, to really be faithful, you need to do this. And in a lot of instances, it's something very general, like you need to live a sanctified life. But then you do get more specific, and this is an example of something more specific where it's like you have to do this, or you have to abstain from this to earn salvation. And a lot of other people are much more subtle about it, but this is a problem that still very much goes on today.
yep,
Christians all over the place. We love to add things on, which is wild, but it's part of our sinful nature to try and do it ourselves.
yeah. And I mean, I think it's in part driven by our desire for people not to be damned. Somebody dies in the family, you know that they're not Christian. A lot of us will kind of jump to the,
Well, he was a good person.
yeah, or maybe there's some other way that God lets people in, and then they get to the, well, maybe he did enough good in his life that God is like, yeah, I want you here. But
Yeah.
we're starting to get into realms we can't know anything about, and it contradicts what Scripture tells us about salvation. So anyway, all that being said, I think we can pretty readily agree that when traditions start to cause starvation, it has crossed some kind of line in terms of helpfulness. And mandating a tradition as part of salvation is also not scriptural. from everything that we've seen and that we know, right? So,
I mean, not to toot my own horn, but I've read the whole thing a couple times.
yeah.
And
Same.
there's nothing in there about you have to believe Jesus is Lord and also butter your bread on both sides. Like, that's not in there. Or, fill in your blank. Like, I can assure you. I've read cover to cover a couple times. There are some weird things in Leviticus about things that you used to have to do that you don't really have to do anymore, but none of them are believe in Jesus and also X. Ben was thinking real hard about it.
No, I was trying to stifle a yawn. It's been a long day already.
You had a facial expression and a half on right there, so
Yeah, it was a big yawn. So, Josh, my question as a follow-up to this, there are all sorts of things that we do in Lutheranism and, in the Christian world in general that we do because they're helpful. And you might even call those traditions. Some people might even say that some of them are mandated, depending on who you ask and what part of Lutheranism.
yeah.
So, in your mind, what makes a tradition good? What makes it worthwhile?
I'm writing a sermon on the end of John for this week.
Okay.
And this isn't at the end of John. This is in the penultimate chapter of John, the second to last chapter of John. And he's explaining the purpose of the book. And he says, these things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you. So when you say, is a tradition helpful? That is my fundamental line. Is it helping us to believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that by believing we have life in his name? And that is the first and foremost qualifier. And if it detracts from that, it is not a helpful tradition. But that's not the only qualifier. Because there is kind of this middle ground where maybe it's not directly. Actually, I'm going to cut myself off because the sentence, I was just going to say an empty sentence that described nothing. So, moving on. The realm where I think traditions are especially helpful, and this comes from a little bit of bias, right? I have a background in education. I'm studying for my doctorate of education. So, like, education's a key step for me. But traditions can be supremely helpful in teaching us things and also informing us. There's 2/3 of a great book called Desiring the Kingdom by James K.A. Smith. And if you would like a dense read, go for it. It's not an easy book to read. But he makes an excellent, because the things we do regularly shape who we are. They become habits. They do change our character. And as someone who's writing a dissertation adjacent to that topic, I can tell you the research confirms, turns out if you do something every single day for years, it has an impact on your character, right? So this is where traditions come in. And I'm going to just go at it head on. Traditional worship is something that people get really up in arms about in the LCMS. There are people who are very aggressively for traditional worship, and there are also people who are very aggressively against it. Now, here's the value of traditional worship, where you do the same thing every week. You repeat the same kinds of prayers. You repeat the same creed. You learn those things exceedingly well. And that means you are really well equipped with prayers. You are very well equipped with this creed that speaks the fundamentals of what we believe. And the fascinating thing, I've never personally had this experience, but I've had a lot of pastors who have shared with me stories about they go to visit someone in a memory care unit. They go to visit someone who's struggling with Alzheimer's or dementia or some sort of memory issue. And they can't remember names. They can't remember people. But if you start praying the Lord's Prayer with them, or you start reciting the creeds, they still know those. Because turns out, when you go to church every Sunday for 80 years, and every single Sunday you say the Lord's Prayer and you say the creeds, that adds up. And you have done it hundreds of times, and it is ingrained in the most deeply in your neurological connections. So for me, that's a huge part of the benefit of tradition is it ingrains things in our brain, and also it connects us to each other because it's something really cool to say, hey, we're doing this here, and because it's kind of a tradition that we share, they're also doing it down the street, they're also doing it in that other state, they're also doing it, not forecasting in the future, but you go back 100 years, we share this with our predecessors in the faith as well. So that's a real benefit for tradition. And to play on that, it's a community thing too, right? And this applies to traditions that are like, it's traditional, we have a chili cook-off every year, or we do this every year, or we do that every year. Yeah, it's not teaching you anything, but it's drawing you to the community. It's becoming part of this group identity that we have together, which again it draws you closer to people who are pointing you to Christ. And that's the thing with all these traditions. That's the litmus test for me. Is it beneficial? Is it, whether or not it's beneficial, the litmus test is this drawing you closer to Christ and to a better understanding of who he is and who he calls you to be? So that's kind of my line. I don't know if that covers everything, but I'm sure if it doesn't, Ben can cover my gaps.
Yeah, I don't know that there's anything that I would be able to add that would definitely add something that would find itself outside that list, but maybe. I think the definition that I would give generally is something like, is it beneficial for your faith? And that to me means both, does it teach you something about God, and about the things that Jesus has for you, and does it encourage you holy or sanctified living, or whatever you want to call it? Yeah. So I don't know, maybe that covers like an extra square foot, but
Well, and I think the flip side is also true, and I'm about to kick some sacred cows here. If you have
sure.
traditions as an individual or as a family, or hopefully not, but as a body of believers, and you have traditions that are harmful to your faith and understanding things about God, then those are bad and you should stop them.
Mhm.
For example, and here's the part where I'm kicking sacred cows, okay? If you have a tradition that you get together with all your extended family on Christmas Day and you open presents and you have this big breakfast, brunch, dinner thing, whatever, and you're spending all together and you're as a family and we feel so warm and fuzzy because we're all in our flannel pajamas and it's Christmas and we're doing our family things. No. First of all, Christmas is a church holiday. You should be in church. B of all, if you are skipping church so you can be your warm and fuzzies opening gifts, you are celebrating materialism, commercial, like you are celebrating the wrong parts of Christmas. And I would say, and I think Ben will back me up on this, you are actively undermining your discipleship by upholding this tradition where you pointedly are not going to church on Christmas Day. Christmas Day! I hear this from time to time and it drives me nuts. So if you have traditions like that are like putting you in places that you shouldn't be, bad traditions. And this is even more innocent. Like if you have a tradition with, not more innocent. Like if you have traditions that you go out with your college buddies once a year and you get absolutely smashed for a whole weekend, bad tradition. You're doing things you shouldn't do. Don't make a habit, don't make a tradition of doing things you shouldn't be doing in the first place. So there's also the flip side to that which we're talking about, right? Tradition can be kind of objectively good. A tradition can also be pretty objectively bad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Yeah. That's how you measure them. My brothers and sisters in Christ.
There's not a lot in the Lutheran world that we really mandate in terms of like churches have to do this. But what we do mandate, we mandate because we think it's essential to faith. Things like receiving for God's forgiveness, things like being in prayer, being in the scriptures, seeking out his blessing.
Having pastors trained in a certain way.
Yeah.
Like I'm just thinking, because this is a little bit of a side note, but I think it's worth explaining for our listeners.
Yeah, having well-trained church leaders in general.
The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is something called a congregational polity. What that means is the synod, which is the national body, is largely almost in an advisory role. The synod cannot make congregations do very much. They can recommend, they can say, we think this is a good practice, we think you should do this a certain way, but the synod can't make you do a whole lot. So like when Ben's bringing this up, there are only a couple of things that the synod like really says, you gotta do this. One of them is you have to get a pastor from these certain acceptable ways. And that's a tradition that draws people close to faith. You want the person that you're listening to about things of the faith more than any other. You want that person to know what they're talking about and to have the right answers about this important stuff, to be well trained in it. So you have traditions like that, and the ones that, sorry, that was a little bit of a soapbox. Continue, Ben.
Yeah. So with that being said, there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of like what's considered, kind of up for discussion, up for debate, and up for a congregation to choose how they do for themselves. And I think that's important because not every context is the same, and not every context is going to respond the same ways to the same traditions. There are churches that do real well to train up certain traditions within their midst, like to make sure people know the part, or like the different sections of an old liturgy and what they're meant to teach and what they are reminding us to do. And there are other congregations for whom that's just kind of lost. And so you have to find other ways to disciple people into that. Whether that's, you do a lot of hard legwork to train them into that kind of liturgy, or if you just incorporate some of those things in other ways.
I do think it's worth noting, because there are some people who are kind of anti-tradition for different reasons, right? They view it as old-fashioned, or they think it's like out of touch or something. If you are getting rid of a tradition, first of all, you should probably have a good reason for it. But also make sure you understand, what did that tradition accomplish? And if that was something that was important, if that's something worth doing, make sure that you are finding another way to accomplish that. So if you have a tradition where you are training people to understand the Lord's Prayer and to know the Lord's Prayer, but you're going to remove that. So I would never advocate for doing this, but say for some reason in your context, you need to remove the Lord's Prayer from weekly worship. You better have something else in place to teach the congregation members about prayer, about the Lord's Prayer, and so that they know it deeply. So that's kind of the flip side of tradition, is if you find yourself in a context where you are moving away from certain traditions, make sure you're replacing it with something that is, you're putting something in place to cover the gaps that are going to be left behind when you stop or remove this tradition. And that's something, not to critique too much, but that's something that I think sometimes gets lost when congregations transition from traditional to contemporary worship, is some of those things that traditional worship really ingrains in people. There's never a replacement for what it is doing from a discipleship perspective. So when you're making that transition, because contemporary worship tends to be a lot more fluid and there's less that's kind of nailed down, you have to be intentional about, how are we going to make sure people are still grounded in some of these important discipleship issues, right? It's something to think about when we're talking about traditions, and do we keep them, do we leave them, how do we handle it?
Yeah, and I think the dirty truth that nobody really wants to acknowledge is, regardless of what you keep or get rid of, you're upholding traditions. It's just whether those traditions are, tens, hundreds, thousands of years old, or a couple months.
Yeah, you're just picking your timeline.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, like, a lot of the ways that manifests in the modern church, that I think, at least for me, consumes a decent amount of my brain power and my time, are things like music. We have a lot of beautiful hymns in Lutheran tradition, but I have a lot of, Josh looks back at his shelf full of hymnals and
I got two. Lutheran service book, and I have Lutheran worship.
I've got 1, 2, 6.
Jeez. Do you have repeats, or are there 6 different hymnals?
6 different hymnals.
Nerd.
One of them's in Spanish.
Okay, fair. I will say, like, Ben is more of a music person than I am.
Yeah. So I've got the three that the LCMS has put out in its history. The Lutheran Hymnal, which was put out in or I should say the three English ones. I think there was a German one before that. The Lutheran Hymnal, which was put out in 48, I think, if my memory serves
That's
me
the red
correctly.
one, right?
Red or black, sometimes blue or green, depending on where you were.
Oh, they were more flexible.
They were more flexible.
Yeah, we lost that one.
Blue, which was Lutheran Worship, put out in the late 70s, I believe.
I got my copy from the free bookshelf at the seminary because I figured
So did I.
probably wouldn't be a bad thing for me to have a copy of it, just in case.
Exactly. There's a couple of hymns that are in there that aren't in the new Lutheran Service Book, which is also on my hymn.
There are also a couple cool
liturgies and prayers.
Yeah, cool like service outlines.
Yeah,
because it seemed Lutheran Worship, the blue one, when it was building services, this is fascinating to me, was a little more like conversational. Like the language is a little more accessible than the Lutheran Service Book.
Yeah, that's true.
Lutheran Service Book brought back the these and thous. And Lutheran Worship was like, guys, we can just say you and us and you guys. Like, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, the services from Lutheran Worship are in the Lutheran Service Book. They just also brought back the even older services. There's a hymnal that the LCMS put out like 25 years ago for kids called All God's People Sing. I've got a copy of that on my bookshelf.
I've seen that book before. I don't have a copy.
It looks very late 90s. If you ever see one on if you see a book on a pastor's shelf that looks like it's pulled straight out of the 90s, it's because it was. And then I have the Wells hymnal too. Yeah.
Good.
But like, there are all sorts of great music resources that have been formed throughout our church body's history and our theological tradition's history. But not every church is going to be able to sing all that music well. And depending on how like traditionally Lutheran your context is, it may not actually make sense to sing that.
Yeah. Well, like, and I can kind of speak experientially to that because I mean we went to the seminary, and one of the things at the seminary is in chapel every day they use a lot more hymns than you usually would hear in like a congregational setting, because you're assuming that the people at the seminary's chapel service are more broadly familiar with the hymns and the traditions. But I tell you what, some of those hymns they start playing, and I just kind of had. I'm one of those people. You should sing in worship. You should. You should sing along. You should participate as someone in the pews. But there were some I just had to sit and listen because I had no idea how to sing it. The pitch or the tone or whatever, I don't know. It was going all over the place. I was like, I don't know. I can't read music. I was looking at it. I was like, I see the words. I don't know how I'm supposed to sing the words. You guys sound great. Keep up the good work.
Yeah. That's sometimes an issue. And if you find yourself in a situation like that where you're not sure how to sing a song that's being sung in worship, listen as much as is possible. Try and pick up the tune in the first couple of verses, and then
as you hit on the last one, hit a strong fourth verse.
Well, yeah, and then like third verse, try and sing along to the best of your ability, and fourth, amp it up a little bit, and by the end of the song, you're fully in it. Great, you've learned a new hymn tune. Yeah, but like, not everybody that's going to work for. There's a decent amount of good, strong, theologically beautiful and rich music that set to things like guitars.
Which I'm pretty sure a lot of hymns you can also play.
Oh yeah,
on piano or guitar. There are some hymns that I'm like, it doesn't sound right if it's not on an organ. There's just a couple, but there's some that you're like Thy Strong Word. That's got to be on an organ. Come on now.
Honestly, I could see it with like heavily distorted electric guitars.
Yeah, almost like a Metallica version.
Yes.
Yeah, that could work. That could
like
work.
Metal opera style.
A Mighty Fortress might be another one.
Just Mighty Fortress. There are versions of it that I've heard where it's set with like guitar and keyboard and stuff, and it works. It's not as good, but it works. And sometimes you have to change the tune a little bit, and people hate that because you're getting rid of another tradition. But like, you know what? I
And
want
for all your saints, in warfare,
for all the saints in warfare,
yeah, that
or for all the saints from whom.
no, it's kind of like a deeper, darker.
Yeah, I
There are
think you're
like
thinking for all the
27
saints.
verses of it. We always used to sing it on
Yes.
celebrations of the saints.
Yep.
That
That's for all the
one,
saints in
I think
warfare.
you got to hit that on the organ. I'm saying all this as a musically illiterate person.
Fair.
But yeah, so whenever you're talking about tradition, you got to keep in mind, how are you serving the people that are around you? And here's something that is referenced here, that Luther references, that Paul talks about, is when you're talking about a tradition, whether it's to keep it, to start it, to get it going, to kill it, whatever, the people who are going to be engaging in the tradition, how's it impacting them? Also, how's it impacting the people who are watching? How's it impacting the people who are seeing what you're doing? And is it giving a positive witness to the gospel, or is it not? It's worth, like, you got to keep it. Unfortunately, part of the burdens put on us in our sanctification is you got to think of everybody. You can't just think of yourself. You can't just think about your people. You got to think about everyone who's connected and how it's going to impact them, and make the decision for the gospel. You looking up the hymn still?
Yeah, I think it might be by all your saints in warfare.
Yeah, I think you might be right.
Honestly, it's not in the church militant section of the hymnal where I thought it would be.
No. You had a third topic we were going to hit, so I'm going to.
Well, yeah, before that though, like, music's one that takes up a lot of my thinking and my brain power, as to like, what is the best option for our church? Right now I think hymns are still our best go-to, because that's what most people are familiar with. But I've also been in a context when I served in my vicarage in Omaha where I'd say like half of the church grew up in a Lutheran church, but hadn't been there in a while. Like, a lot of them hadn't been there in a while, and the other half did not. So it was way easier to get the congregation involved in singing and disciple them through music to not use Lutheran hymns.
Yeah. So if anyone is curious, by all your saints in warfare, it is hymn in the Lutheran service book. So the Burgundy one, it's hymn 517 and 518, and there are 28 verses. And the idea, the first and the third verse are static, and then the idea
Aren't
is,
there only 27, because 2 doesn't actually have any words, and then you're
you insert whatever verse is appropriate to the festival or the feast that you're celebrating. Which, if you want to learn more about how Lutherans handle saints, you got to go back a couple episodes and listen to our podcast on the cult of the saints. But we have a hymn about them. It's right there in black and white. Well, in black and off-white. Hymnal pages are off-white, not white. It's in there.
Anyway, we're like, the ways that we do specific elements in worship is another one that takes up a lot of my brain power. But I think the one that probably consumes the majority of my thinking, and the one that I think churches have the worst time actually, is the way that we thoughtfully engage with our traditions that have the church engaging with and involved in the world. Like, we create programs and institutions and all sorts of stuff that works for a generation, and then we keep it going for another 4, well past its usable livelihood and lifespan, without ever really like changing it to appropriately reach the world that it's in. And
that's not good.
It doesn't help. Yeah.
Yeah, we'd be better off. That's one instance where I think we're better off fostering a mindset than creating a tradition. So instead of saying we do this to reach out every week, we foster the mindset of we are a church that reaches out. And that way, when it needs to shift, you can shift.
Yep. The last topic, which Josh kind of nodded at, that we're going to talk about today is, when is a tradition a good thing, and what does it look like for a church to kind of encourage, like strongly encourage even sometimes, good traditions versus mandating ones? Like, what does it look like when this is done well? Because there's a tipping point at which a strong encouragement might sound like a mandate, and we don't want people to get their salvation confused here because they didn't go to Sunday school or something.
This is one of those instances where maybe I'm just a Neanderthal. Maybe I'm just a caveman.
Sure.
But I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, hey, you are saved by grace alone. And I'm not saying that you have to do this to be saved. But I am saying that you really should be doing this. It is really good for you to do. Like, I have, and my congregation can testify to this, I have no qualms with being exactly that blunt. Saying, do you have to be in church every week to be saved? No. Should you be in church every week? Yes. Here's one of the things where I think we get in trouble because we overcomplicate it and we try to be really slick and smooth. It's like, sometimes just lay it out.
Tell people how it is. Yeah, I'm with you.
And at some point, if you then mishear that and you say, well, if I say, you don't need this to be saved, but you should do this, and you say, well, clearly I need to do this to be saved, like, that's not on me anymore, right? You have heard the exact opposite of what I was saying. There's only so much I can do, right? I think it's as simple as that. And here's the thing. If you are in any context where someone is saying you have to do something to be saved, and that something isn't believe in the gospel, then you need to call foul. You need to say no. Exactly what this article is doing in the Augsburg Confession. You say, no, I don't have to do that to be saved.
Eat your butter.
Unless your doctor has told you to lay off the butter. But again, that's not your salvation, right? It's just maybe if you eat too much butter, you get to meet Jesus sooner. And
also, don't do that. Like, steward your body well?
Yeah. We're called to be stewards of that too.
Yep.
God said take good care of it.
So, it sounds like we're maybe moving towards takeaways here, Josh.
I'm happy for takeaways.
Cool. But as we get into that, yeah, remember that, like, none of the things that we as a church do are mandatory for heaven. Are they helpful on some scale, from like just regular helpful to like exceedingly helpful? Yes, but they're not mandatory. And if you feel like something that the church that you are attending is doing is not helpful anymore, or perhaps worse, even damaging to people's faith and their proper understanding of the work of God in their lives, especially through Jesus Christ, then talk to your pastor, talk to church leadership.
Initiate that conversation, because you don't know, it might be helpful to someone that is outside of your perspective.
Yeah.
And so have a conversation about it. Don't just light it on fire right away.
Yeah. And it might be helpful to your pastor or the leadership as they, are trying to be thoughtful about some of these things. So, Josh, takeaways?
My takeaway is do things that are good for your faith and your practice, but don't make them more important than they need to be. With that, It has been a pleasure. Brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
It says stopping.
Interesting. Well, if you're still hearing this at the end of the episode, welcome. This is the Easter egg. This is the post-credit scene.
We're still here. All right, Ben. I'm gonna leave the room, and hopefully that'll stop it. I'll talk to you next week.